So we've reached the end of section 10, and I appreciate this is quite a long section to just deal with something as seemingly simple as error handling. But one of the ways I like to handle this is to do it once and get it out of the way with, so I don't really need to think about it when I'm developing the rest of the application. But when we do hit errors now, we're going to get good information from our components when we do encounter an error we're not expecting. So the learning goals for this section, we took a look at validation, and we can now validate our requests. And we're only doing this in two places. You can be more defensive than I've been here. I was only concerned about validating against the objects we're passing to our API from the client, and also doing client-side validation as well. Now, both are necessary, and in fact, we haven't touched client-side validation yet because we're deferring that until we take a look at forms, because if we try and do validation on our client side whilst we're using just basic React functionality, then we're going to end up with a lot of code in our form components. So I have deferred the client side validation until the next section. We've also taken a look at handling HTTP error responses, and one of the themes of this course is clean architecture. Our application, our business logic, should be able to function regardless of whether we're using an API or a console app or any other way of presenting our logic to a client. Even if it's a Windows Forms presentation kind of app, we'd still use the same business logic in the application layer. We also took a look at handling exceptions, and now we've got a centralized place using custom middleware to take care of any exceptions that come via our API. And again, we're not handling exceptions in our application layer. All we've done is created a simple object that our API is going to use, and then the API decides what it wants to do with exceptions. If we were using something else like a console app, then you would need to think about how you want to handle the exceptions. But because we're using an API and we've got the opportunity to use custom middleware, that's what we're doing. And we've also taken a further look at using Axios interceptors to intercept any HTTP error responses, and then we've got an option to do something on the client with those responses. So just a frequently asked question, and if you're thinking about clean architecture, is the use of Fluent validation breaking clean architecture principles? Now, we've installed Fluent validation to our application project. And what we really want to ask ourselves is, can I change the API to something like a console app without changing the logic in the application or the use cases layer? Now, for practical and pragmatic reasons, we used a feature of Fluent validation to use a method it provides to configure our API to use those responses, and because of our API controller attribute, it automatically formats the response into a validation error and presents it to the client. Now, there are other features of Fluent validation. There are other features of Mediator where we can add middleware to do something with the validated request, but because we're using an API, then we're just using the most efficient way of getting the validation responses out there. But it would be something to think about, because the application on its own, just using Fluent validation, doesn't know how to format the responses to the client. So that would be something that you would need to do if you were swapping your API for something else. But we're going to be pragmatic, and we're going to be practical, and we're going to take advantage of certain features that are provided by using an API if and when we can use them. So what we're going to take a look at next is we are going to cover client-side validation, but along a bigger picture of using forms in React. And we're going to take a look at that next.